Hello, and welcome to today's Decarbonizing the West initiative webinar. My name is Abby, and I'm a policy advisor at the Western Governors Association. I thank you all for joining us today to discuss liabilities for long-term carbon storage. Decarbonizing the West is WGA's 2024 chair initiative under Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon, examining how decarbonization strategies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, direct air capture, and enhanced natural sequestration can position Western states to be leaders in innovation and carbon emissions reduction. WGA launched this initiative in June of last year, and since then, we have conducted a rigorous stakeholder engagement process through surveys and a regional workshop series, and now webinars to identify best practices and generate policy recommendations. WGA will compile and publish these findings and recommendations into a report, which will be used to inform future Western governors' policy and advocacy efforts. This report will be released in conjunction with our annual meeting, June 10th through 12th in Olympic Valley, California. And if you are interested in hearing how some of these workshop conversations unfolded or would like to contribute to the initiative survey, all of those resources are available on WGA's website. Before going any further into today's webinar discussion, I would like to take a moment to recognize our initiative partners, including Basin Electric Power Cooperative, Google Energy, Idaho National Lab, JP Morgan Chase, Net Power, Tri-State, and the Walton Family Foundation. Their support makes a lot of this work possible, and we thank them for their continued partnership. Throughout this initiative, we have explored many different aspects of carbon storage, including technical, regulatory, and social factors that affect the ability to develop and scale up storage projects. A process for addressing or assuming the long-term liabilities associated with geologic storage of carbon is an essential policy component for facilitating CCUS or direct air capture projects. On today's webinar, you will get to hear more about some of these liability frameworks, other challenges associated with long-term geologic storage, and some ongoing efforts in Western states to address these issues. Today, I am joined by Madeleine Lewis, a licensed attorney and policy research scientist at the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, and Reice Haase, Deputy Director of the North Dakota Industrial Commission. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions for our experts, please submit them through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get through them. To kick off our discussion today, I'll hand things over to Maddie to give us some background on the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources and talk about some of Wyoming's decarbonization efforts. Maddie, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Abby. All right. Well, I'd just like to thank WGA for the opportunity to be here today. I am hopeful that it's going to be a informative conversation, and I'm sure I'll learn a few new things as well. So for those of you on the call or the webinar who may not be familiar with the University of Wyoming, much less the School of Energy Resources, I thought I'd provide a brief overview. So the University of Wyoming, located in Laramie, has this School of Energy Resources, SER as it's abbreviated, that is pretty unique in terms of the research, academic, and policy functions that it balances. So our mission statement, which drives everything we do, is to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming. So for us, that means conducting research, a lot of DOE grants. We have a robust academic program consisting of, both degree programs, certificate programs, as well as other types of offerings that, help promote the, energy IQ of students at UW in general. And then our research function is spread across 12 different centers of research excellence. So these are 4 that I've highlighted here. Our Center for Economic Geology Research is headed up by a number of extremely capable and intelligent geologists who I really enjoy working with. They've been doing a lot of work on DOE carbon safe grants over the past few years, as well as work on critical minerals. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. We also have the Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis, which really balances stakeholder engagement, policy research. We produce a lot of policy documents that are intended to be used in, forming legislation or, just informing on issues about how policy should be made and the types of considerations that go into it. We also have our Center for Carbon Capture and Conversion, which is focused on supporting the future of Wyoming coal and creating economic development and diversification opportunities. Some really exciting work out there, or from that center in particular right now, is focused on the use of coal in creating bricks for building houses as well as asphalt. And then finally, we have our Hydrogen Energy Research Center, which is one of our newer centers, and that's focused on applied research to identify and quantify the relative competitive advantages of Wyoming in an emerging hydrogen economy. We have a lot of natural gas feedstock to, create hydrogen and become a hub for that type of industry, but there's a lot of overlap with CCS there, as the state is looking to integrate carbon management. So as I've noted, just a few program highlights. I've already talked about DOE's Carbon Safe Initiative. So that initiative is focused on promoting the identification and characterization of sites suitable for long-term geologic storage of CO2 associated with CCS. So Carbon Safe stands for, or I guess just the safe part stands for Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise. So we're currently, as of 2024, involved in 4 different carbon safe projects, including the Hero Basalt Carbon Safe Project, which, although it's located in Oregon, that's where the field site is, it's exploring the potential for CCS and at a power plant that utilizes Wyoming natural gas. Our Sweetwater Carbon Storage Hub, which is led by SER in partnership with Frontier Carbon Solutions, that will ultimately comprise over 100,000 acres of leased pore space and over 550 million metric tons of CO2 storage capacity across Southwest Wyoming, as well as our Williams Echo Springs Carbon Safe Project in South Central Wyoming, which is a feasibility study to develop a CO2 storage hub in a saline reservoir. And then we also have our Dry Fork Station in Northeast Wyoming. That's our oldest carbon safe project, is studying, the suitability for storage up there at a very new power plant, a coal-fired power plant. Our critical minerals program is primarily focused on DOE's carbon ore, rare earth, and critical minerals initiative. So we're looking at the potential for alternative applications of coal, the ability to derive critical minerals that are needed for renewable energy manufacturing and development for those technologies. So, the potential to derive those elements that we desperately need over the next decades from coal. And then finally, as I noted, we have a robust academic program. One thing that I'm really excited about is that we're offering now a CCUS certificate program for students who are interested in gathering that skill set to contribute to the workforce that we'll be building around that industry in Wyoming. Something else I'd like to highlight is our Quick Start 3+3 program, which provides students with the opportunity to complete their undergrad in 3 years and then go straight on to law school, so that we have a growing number of law students who are ready and able to dive right in to the number of pressing energy law issues that are arising. And then I'll also highlight the Peace Corps partnership, which is the Plains CO2 reduction partnership, which Wyoming is involved in. It's led by the Energy and Environmental Research Center. Reice can correct me on that, in North Dakota, the EERC. And there's been a lot of great collaboration there happening regionally to ensure that CCS can scale in a way that goes beyond Wyoming's boundaries and the boundaries of other states as well, because basins and storage reservoirs are ultimately regional. And then just a few highlights of some recent products that might be helpful for anyone with questions after this webinar to browse. Here are 4 recent studies that we released. I think 3 of them are from the Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis. But our recent research has focused on the regulatory considerations for CO2 storage and plume migration on interstate and federal lands. So as we'll talk about today, a lot of the CO2 capture and storage frameworks are founded at a state level. And so that can create some questions as to how it works when a project, either goes onto federal lands or goes into 2 states or more states. We also have recently Professor Tara Righetti co-authored a landowner's guide for CCUS, which is a great resource for any landowners with questions about how this might impact them. Social License for Wyoming's Energy Future, a replication study, was released in September 2023. And that studies Wyoming residents' attitudes about energy development and their inclinations to accept certain technologies or energy industries over others. And then finally, most recently, we released a report that summarizes Wyoming's Class 6 risk management system. So those can all be found on SER's website. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from Reice now.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. We'll turn it over to Reice to share his screen and give us some background about the work North Dakota's doing.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Maddie. I am Reice Haase. I am the Deputy Director of the North Dakota Industrial Commission. Wanted to start off with some background on our Industrial Commission. The Industrial Commission of North Dakota is really unique. I don't know that many states have an entity like it. Our Industrial Commission is made up of our governor, who's our chairman, our attorney general, and our agricultural commissioner, and those 3 are tasked with overseeing and managing industries on the state's behalf, as well as acting as the state's finance agency. So we actually cover quite a bit of ground. As you can see here, we are showing our organizational chart of all of the various agencies, entities, programs, et cetera, that the Industrial Commission of North Dakota covers. Where I fit into this is in the Office of the Industrial Commission. We act as kind of the day-to-day manager of the Industrial Commission's work. We facilitate their day-to-day work and oversee all of its various programs. And we act as a liaison between its agencies and the commission itself. One area that most people, when they think of the North Dakota Industrial Commission, they think of our Department of Mineral Resources and our regulatory authority over oil and gas industry, mineral development, Class 6. We, of course, cover a wide variety of other issues as well, and in particular in our state research and development programs. As it relates to our work on carbon capture, and just really want to highlight, the purpose and need for carbon capture and utilization, what's really driving, our interest in it at our state of North Dakota. We are pretty alarmed at some of the baseload power plant retirements out there. This graph on the right, the graph came from MISO, which is our regional grid that North Dakota is a part of, showing the growing delta between installed capacity and accredited capacity. What that means is a power generation facility that could be accredited and have dispatchable baseload energy that can be dispatched at a moment's notice. Those types of facilities are retiring, and they aren't being replaced by entities that can meet that baseload accredited capacity need. So we do have some concerns about the needs for the power grid, and that, of course, is one of our top priorities in North Dakota. One of the primary drivers of our interest in carbon capture, what role it can play in preserving our baseload and having a carbon neutral, or in some cases even a carbon negative baseload power that can remain competitive on the grid and help shore up some of those capacity concerns. Of course, we're also acknowledging ESG-driven capital markets and some of the shifting markets and demands there. The North Dakota Department of Commerce estimates that over $50 trillion of global capital is now tied in some way, shape, or form to an ESG type metric. And within that, we actually see a lot of opportunity in North Dakota for positioning our state and our producers to really be very competitive in that market. Of course, carbon capture and utilization is key to that strategy. Within our state, we're currently deriving, 63% in some way, shape, or form of our state revenues come directly from our oil and gas revenues, our oil and gas taxes, primarily from the Bakken oil fields. That is set to start to mature in the mid-2030s and maybe even start to decline if we do not have some sort of enhanced oil recovery to keep those fields going. We see huge potential with carbon capture and utilization using CO2 as an EOR to further produce our fields. Of course, our demand for low carbon ethanol, it's not just our energy industry, our agricultural industry as well, is heavily dependent on the future of CCUS for their future of their industry as well. And we think in particular about ethanol. If we do not have a low carbon ethanol product, there is some concern at what the future of our ethanol industry could look like. So it all kind of ties back to CCUS. But like I mentioned earlier, we really see it as a unique opportunity, one that North Dakota in particular, we're very proud of, how we're uniquely positioned to capitalize on the CO2 opportunities. We really see it as an opportunity. We were the first state with a Class 6 primacy. I know Wyoming was close second. So between Wyoming, North Dakota, now I believe Louisiana, there are 3 states now that have primacy over the Class 6 CO2 injection program. In North Dakota, thanks to a lot of the work that has been done by the EERC and some of the work that Maddie mentioned in her comments through PCOR and Carbon Safe, some of the other initiatives, we have quantified that over 252 billion tons of CO2 storage potential just in North Dakota. It's a large number. Put that in perspective, that's 4,400 years worth of our state's annual CO2 footprint, or 50 years of the entire US's CO2 footprint that we could store here in North Dakota. Of course, we're also interested in the U aspect of CCUS utilization, not just storage. We've been funding quite a number of projects through our research and development arms at the Industrial Commission. And one I have here on this slide, the picture of a mixed carbonate plate. This was funded through our lignite research program. This is using CO2 as a feedstock to create an artificial carbonate plate that can then be used as a building material. It can be used as an alternative for granite countertops, quite a number of uses. 30% of this material is actually sequestered CO2. So they take a CO2 stream, they bubble it through water and create this artificial carbonate that we're currently testing for a variety of uses, but you could actually potentially have a carbon negative building using some of this building material. So really excited about that opportunity. When we mentioned the enhanced oil recovery opportunity, up to 10 billion additional barrels of oil that in North Dakota we could produce using our CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And it's currently already in progress in the southwest corner of our state in Bowman County. Denbury Resources is already doing it on the Cedar Creek anticline, and they've calculated that their barrels of oil are carbon negative. They are sequestering more CO2 than that barrel of oil will produce in its life cycle. And we're very confident about what the future holds for our Bakken using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and being able to market a carbon negative barrel of oil, something we're very excited about. What it, of course, means for our state as well is over $70 billion in additional tax revenues. That's just production and extraction tax from the oil industry using CO2. It's not, it doesn't include any of the additional revenues or benefits. So very excited about our opportunities. But as we start thinking about risk management, this is something that North Dakota, I think, started very early on. We were relative latecomers to oil and gas production compared to most other states. Our production started in 1951. Even prior to our oil production, we had a state geologist propose pretty comprehensive rules and a regulatory framework, trying to strike a balance between providing regulatory oversight and safety and data collection, but at the same time providing industry with a balanced approach and consistent, stable regulatory environment that they could thrive in. As part of that, I think one key component when we think about risk management, especially when it comes to CO2, one of our requirements was that operators submit core samples when they drill a well, whether it's a test well or production well. That core is then sent to our core library in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's overseen by the Geological Survey, one of our industrial commission agencies. We have over 92 miles of core currently at the core library. And as part of our transparency efforts, we're working to make that more and more accessible to researchers as well as the general public by photographing that core and making those photographs available on our website. So it doesn't require a researcher to physically visit the library necessarily. They could do a lot of their research online and see photographs of the core and just help with further understanding some of the geological considerations early on in a project. When we think about orphan wells, North Dakota has required pretty robust data from day one from all of our operators whenever a well is drilled. We can proudly say that we know where every single wellbore is in North Dakota. We have no concerns with orphan wells in the sense that not knowing where a wellbore is, because we know where they all are. We have logs, we have documentation. And in any orphan wells that we have today, knowing where they all are and having a pretty robust kind of insurance fund, if you will, through our abandoned well program to have some funds available to plug and abandon those well bores. So when it relates to CCUS, we can help minimize some of the uncertainty there when developing a CO2 storage facility as it relates to abandoned well bores. And then, of course, our geology in North Dakota, we are also very confident in our geology. We have very stable geology. We have no concerns with induced seismicity, low concerns with earthquakes. We don't have active faults and earthquakes in North Dakota. And as we continue some of the work on data collection, one of our areas in particular that we're focusing on is landslide mapping and thinking about some of the surface infrastructure, pipeline transportation of CO2, and potential risk mitigation as there. We have publicly available landslide maps for the entire state of North Dakota. We started off with LiDAR coverage. That was a statewide coverage. We, of course, repeat imagery and monitoring of that to monitor any of those identified landslide risk areas, to map out any areas of slope failure and any identified landslides. We have just under 68,000 landslides across the state that we now have mapped. We have shape files for those shape files, and those maps are all publicly available on our website. So anyone who's interested in learning more, or if maybe a project developer is working on siting a pipeline, they can pretty easily download a shape file of all landslides in North Dakota, and meant as a another risk management strategy to help avoid some of those areas when we are developing infrastructure. I'd also like to mention, a lot of our work is in our research and development arm at the Industrial Commission. We have quite a number of energy-related research and development programs that have been developed over the years. Our work here started in 1987 with our Lignite Research Council, and over the years we've added to that with oil and gas, renewable, our State Energy Research Fund, our Clean Sustainable Energy Authority. This is all funded by industry tax dollars. So not a dime of general taxpayer funds go into this. It's all filled by our oil and gas production and extraction taxes that help pay for our research, reinvest in our tax dollars back into the energy industry for further research and development. Each fund is overseen by a council that's appointed by the governor. They are all industry peers overseeing the council, and they are guiding the Industrial Commission on how we best spend these funds and which projects to fund. So just a note on how our research and development has started to evolve over the years. We really focused initially on our kind of research and development and demonstration phases. Those were our first three programs with our lignite, oil and gas, and renewable research programs. But over time, we knew that there was a few missing pieces and a few missing pieces to the puzzle that we've since filled in. The next was, on some of this early exploratory research may not be ready for a demonstration project yet, maybe very early phase. We have now $7.5 million of funding per biennium for a state energy research fund, which is at our Energy and Environmental Research Center. That's to cover any of those early ideas as they come up, and to be more responsive to emerging issues. And then lastly, our Clean Sustainable Energy program. We knew, of course, a major goal of all of this was to commercialize new and emerging technologies for carbon capture, for low emissions technologies for the energy industry, for low emissions manufacturing. So the goal of our Clean Sustainable Energy Authority is to be more focused on that commercialization. Once a research project is confidently developed and ready to commercialize, but may not have the confidence in the private sector financing, we would help fill the gap with our Clean Sustainable Energy Authority with long-term low interest loans or with grant funding. Over 2 decades, we've been in particular involved with CCUS, a variety of CCUS research projects, development, risk mitigation. We've invested as a state a little over $4.5 billion, and most of that came from the private sector. So a little over $300 million of state dollars, whether it was grants or loans, which was matched by the private sector of over $4 billion of private sector investment to really work on developing this new technology, answering a lot of the early questions, conducting geological research, and a lot of risk mitigation that went into it. I mentioned earlier our stable tax and regulatory environment. That's really one of our goals in North Dakota to help drive additional CCUS development. Some of our work here, in particular, our policy work on CCUS tax exemptions. We have tax exemptions for equipment for CCUS. We allow utilities to recover in their rate recovery any costs to implement CCUS. We also exempt any development from products that were created with some sort of CCUS component from any sort of sales tax, from production and extraction taxes, just as a further incentive. And then as we think about the regulatory environment, we have a pretty robust regulatory framework that we've developed to foster continued growth with CCUS. In particular on pore space, we have an amalgamation threshold. So if a project sponsor achieves 60% of lessee support, the Industrial Commission has, through its police powers, the ability to amalgamate those pore space owners into one facility to really facilitate further development of the CCUS storage facilities. And through our Department of Mineral Resources at the Industrial Commission, it's our regulatory arm for permitting and regulating the operations, regulating how much can be injected at what rates and pressures, ensuring there's no fractures into any other zones beyond the storage facility, et cetera. And really, we based a lot of our initial framework off of model legislation from the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It was an effort that was ongoing since at least the early 2000s and continues today, where we remain engaged, and we're currently working with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission to update the model legislation based on recent lessons learned. So when we think about long-term certainty as it relates to CCUS, what we have set up in North Dakota is a CO2 trust fund. It acts as kind of our insurance fund. We have a fee per ton of CO2 injected that gets deposited into this fund, and we have different thresholds depending on if it's an in-state or an out-of-state CO2 source. So if it's in-state, it's 7 cents per ton gets deposited into this CO2 trust fund. If it's an out-of-state source, we have some flexibility in our Century Code that allows our Department of Mineral Resources director to set by hearing a different variable rate fee based on risk and risk assessment of the project. Our commission, sets by rule the fees, so we do have some flexibility in how we, can adjust those fees over time. If, let's say, we feel that there may be increased risk, we could, by rule, set an increased fee. Or if, the risk we notice is, there's a lower risk, we can lower that fee accordingly. One other important area to note the state of North Dakota assumes permanent title to any injected CO2 post-injection. We provide that, as another risk mitigation strategy. We know an operator may not be able to demonstrate, over 1,000 years worth of liability protection for the injected CO2. So we know the state of North Dakota would be a kind of a credible entity that could take permanent title to that. And of course, with the CO2 trust fund, the really intent behind that, of course, is we would have this funding to assist if there were any future mitigation efforts needed, any future issues with the wellbore or something along those lines. We would have this insurance fund to fall back on to help pay for some of that mitigation. And we also have a robust requirement for post-injection certification. An operator will need to demonstrate to the Industrial Commission that this injected CO2 is safely sequestered. They're required to have monitoring wells and a wide variety of monitoring strategies to demonstrate that the CO2 is truly sequestered and that the risk is low and mitigated before the state would agree to take to issue a post-injection certification and take title to that CO2. So that's all I have for opening remarks. Happy to answer any questions, Abby.
Great. Thanks so much, Reice. I guess to start, Reice, you mentioned elements of North Dakota's risk management strategy. And I guess, we know that storage projects can come with a high degree of risk or uncertainty. And factors like site geology can affect whether and to what extent that risk manifests. And that uncertainty can be enough to deter storage operators or investors without some sort of liability limit. So maybe could you discuss some of what those risks are and how do we balance long-term risks with the current need to scale up CCUS and direct air capture technologies?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think, like I mentioned early on, data collection is key. Having publicly available data really helps manage some of that early risk. Having a stable and consistent regulatory environment where, for example, we think about some of the early survey work that's required, any of the early seismic work and that type of work, having a clear set of rules and regulatory requirements for conducting that work, clear lines of communication, and a clear jurisdiction for which agency would have jurisdiction and which agency you would work through. I think that is key to help facilitate some of that early work. I think one of the huge areas of rising uncertainty really lies within the engagement between the local county and township officials, how they engage with project sponsors as well as state agencies. And there seems to be quite a bit of uncertainty as to where the regulatory authority lies. I think just having that clearly laid out is a key for managing some of that early risk. And certainly within the regulatory framework, whichever agency is regulating the injection would set within their permits any sort of injection rate limitations, injection pressures, and continue to follow up with monitoring of that to ensure that there are no fractures into overlying formations or wellbore integrity issues and things like that.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Reice has said. I think that the early work that goes into site characterization and ensuring, that the reservoir is going to be totally secure is the best way to balance against potential risks that could result. I think from a policy perspective, there are two objectives that states have had to balance. On one hand, we've traditionally followed the polluter pays principle for, however many years in the United States. And this presents kind of a different issue because, CCUS is serving a societally beneficial end by, helping mitigate climate change potentially. So I think that what you see reflected in these state statutes and, as Reice was talking about with the trust fund and, I'm not sure if you mentioned the mechanisms that states have to eventually release liability or that operators can release liability to the state after a certain amount of time. But I think that you see in those specific mechanisms how each state has kind of decided to balance these risks differently. And yeah, I would also just agree with what Reice said about the need for clear regulatory authority around different, tasks and functions. I think that that's been something that I've been spending a lot of time and research on recently, and it's different for every state, and there are a lot of issues that you don't see until they come up. But yeah, I think that the more time that states can spend early on as their CCS industries are developing in answering those questions and looking to other states and seeing what has worked, that's a great way to build trust in the public and make sure that those risks are balanced with all the information that we have.
Yeah, definitely. And, another topic that has come up throughout this initiative in terms of generating trust from the public is MRV and monitoring, reporting, verification. And although, the geologic or seismicity and leakage risks are relatively low to our knowledge for some of these storage projects, how can we build trust in MRV methods and use some of those findings to defray potential costs of long-term liability?
So when we think about building trust, I think clear communication is key, but also acknowledging that you need to clearly communicate to a non-technical audience. If you use a lot of technical jargon or industry slang, the general public may not understand, and then you lose that trust. So acknowledging that you need to communicate this to a non-technical audience, but having a clear methodology for meter proving, regular calibration, but I think follow-up, of course, is key. Having frequent inspections, frequent audits, having that publicly available. But once again, being able to present that in a non-technical way to a general audience. And we mentioned our trust fund dollars, using that as a sort of insurance. If future discrepancies occur, you can have that to fall back on. I know one example that we ran into in North Dakota with one of our projects. They're selling low carbon ethanol into the California markets. And one question they had is, what happens 200 years from now if that CO2 were to be somehow released or escape or something like that? And we've already paid you a premium today for your low carbon ethanol. And, our answer was, we have this insurance fund to fall back on, our CO2 trust fund, to help mitigate any of that risk. And that can be a resource in those types of scenarios.
Yeah, I would agree that the need to communicate at a non-technical level is absolutely key. And that's a lot of the work that we do at SER is focused on that, improving not only the energy IQ of our students who go through our, professional land management programs or our CCUS certificate programs, but, we're shifting focus also to how do we, make sure that students who are graduating from Wyoming public schools are coming out with an understanding of how these things work. And I think, and that's more broadly related to, how energy systems work in general. But I think, you can't expect, just someone who isn't working in this field day in and day out to understand, what exactly, to parse through MRV reporting themselves or try to figure that information out. I mean, Class 6 permits can be, nearly 1,000 pages was the most recent one I was looking at. So I think those, any monitoring or reporting or verification that comes afterwards needs to be in a place that's publicly accessible and in a, from, sources that they can also trust as well. And potentially getting third-party validators could be helpful, but yeah, that's certainly a challenge for the industry.
Question for Reice from the chat. When you talk about risk, you're discussing surface risks or financial risks rather than a safety risk with the long-term storage of CO2 miles below the surface. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's primarily correct. I think from a safety perspective, we are pretty confident in this ability to sequester, considering our geology, considering our known stable geology, any additional, research up front, whether it's seismic surveys to map potential faults, et cetera. And then we think about some of the permit requirements that are put on their injection to ensure that they're not going to, lose containment or frack into an overlying zone or anything like that. I think we do have a pretty robust, safety risk mitigation as well.
And, we've talked a lot about Class 6. And, Maddie, you mentioned that a lot of these policy frameworks are really regionally based, and states are sort of the first step at leading some of these efforts. And with Class 6, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act, I guess the regulatory framework for liability at the federal level is not maybe the most clear to industry proponents. So I guess the question is, are there certain legislative or regulatory changes at the federal level that could be implemented or bolstered to facilitate some of this process in geologic storage?
I can start on that. So I think, it really has developed at the state level, as you're talking about. The states have kind of borne the brunt of that. I think, I know that at least, I think it's in Kentucky, they have a statute that contemplates, the creation of a federal program similar to what Reice has described for the acceptance of liability long-term. And, in Kentucky, they would have, if such a program were ever created, liability is passed off to that federal program. I think ultimately, I don't know. I think that the state of Wyoming is pretty good at handling, what comes up, and it may be different though for states that haven't obtained primacy. And so, North Dakota's experience would be the same as Wyoming's in the respect that we both have. But yeah, Reice, do you have thoughts on that?
I think really more of a philosophical way of looking at it. Like, it seems like we currently see it as a waste and have kind of a waste disposal type of regulatory framework, when we really should be looking at it as a beneficial use type of regulatory framework. What I mean by that, waste disposal, seeing it as a liability, really lacking incentives. There is really no public benefit really argued there, where I would argue there really is a public benefit. We really should see it as a beneficial use and really focus more on the U side of CCUS, foster some of those markets and incentive developments, seeing the CO2 as a resource for future use. I argue, that would really be kind of our truly global solution. If you are in an area, maybe you don't have great geology everywhere, you wouldn't necessarily be seeing the storage as your only option, seeing a utilization really grow out of it as well, really having an incentive to implement it anywhere. And when we think about specifically what we could be doing at the federal level, one area that we have, kind of pushed and discussed in North Dakota is the 45Q tax credit, which currently it offers an 85 cents or $85 per ton for storage, but only $65 a ton for utilization. When we would argue really that should be the same, whether you're storing it, whether you're utilizing it. We would argue for a consistent treatment across the board for our 45Q tax credit, not being a disincentive for utilization, but having the same incentive for both storage and utilization.
Yeah. Okay, question from the chat. Does the North Dakota post-injection liability facility match EPA Class 6 requirements? Has the state insurance pool you have set up been an attractive feature for new project developers in carbon storage?
Sure, so I'll take the first part. Yes, the post-injection requirements do match EPA requirements. Of course, when we achieved primacy, we had to demonstrate to EPA that our regulations either were equivalent or more stringent than EPA requirements. Our approach to it was to draft our own regulatory framework, our own regulations. We did not adopt EPA's by reference, but we did demonstrate to EPA that through our regulatory regime, our own rules and regulations in North Dakota, we could demonstrate that they were just as strict, if not more stringent than the EPA requirements. And we did achieve our primacy through that kind of strategy. And the second part of the question was related to the kind of insurance fund. I would say, once again, I would argue, yes, it has been attractive to project developers knowing that, they have the certainty. They don't have that kind of long-term liability hanging over their head. They have kind of the full faith and credit, if you will, of the state of North Dakota. Once they demonstrate post-injection, it's not that we're giving them a free pass. Of course, there's kind of a balance there, but having that long-term certainty, I would argue, certainly has been attractive for them as well.
Here's another good question from the chat. What is the EPA doing to provide technical assistance in long-term monitoring of wells in states with primacy? Could there be more collaboration between EPA and states?
So I can take a stab at this one. I know in North Dakota's case, when we developed our primacy agreement with EPA, we had an MOU with EPA that kind of clearly laid out which agency was to take which role, trying to prevent a situation where one agency may be stepping on the other's toes or eliminating any of that uncertainty of who's responsible for what. I think that was helpful. That was real key to developing our relationship with EPA, and as it relates to who's responsible for monitoring, I'd say we've been pretty happy with the way that's worked out, at least in our case.
Yeah, and I don't know the full ins and outs of how the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, what their, scope of collaboration is with EPA at this point with primacy. I know that there are, certain requirements by statute for notification when certain activities occur. But as Reice said, I think that there's been pretty clear delineation of whose responsibility is whose. I think, though, that there would always be room for, technical assistance if it was sought from EPA. I think that there is that collaboration there.
Well, see if there's any more questions in the chat. How did North Dakota determine the per ton rate for the liability fund?
Great question. Obviously, pretty robust discussions went into that, and kind of the compromise we came up with, because there was a lot of discussion on in-state versus out-of-state. What risks would be presented if we were accepting out-of-state CO2? And of course, there's a lot of interest in North Dakota receiving quite a number of out-of-state projects bringing their CO2 to North Dakota for sequestration. So the 7 cents per ton was determined just based on risk assessments, risk mitigation from our Department of Mineral Resources. And we have the flexibility through admin rule, instead of putting it in Sentry Code, our Sentry Code gave us the authority. Our administrative rules set the amount, gives us some flexibility. If we see any sort of dynamic changes, anything like that, we can have the flexibility to change our rates through administrative rule to adjust accordingly. For out-of-state CO2, we didn't necessarily want to put a number on it. We wanted to have flexibility. So we would have a hearing to determine that amount based on a project by project specific requirements, what the risk assessment of each of those individual projects would show.
Going back to some of those longer term risks for storage, and I know in her opening remarks, Maddie, you mentioned the plumage and some of those issues. And so I guess, other industrial sectors experience different shades of this issue in some variety. But I guess in the context of carbon and carbon storage, if there are damages or leakages that occur outside of that permitted or least boundary for a storage site, what's the process for addressing that, and what's sort of the framework for going about that?
So as we've kind of touched on throughout, there are statutes in place both in Wyoming and North Dakota that would allow a storage operator to apply to transfer liability to the state after receiving a certificate of project completion. And in Wyoming, the earliest you can apply for that certificate is 20 years after injections have ceased. So at that point, there's a geologic sequestration trust fund. I'm going to get the exact name of it wrong, but the trust account that, you know, as Reice has described, it's a per ton fee for CO2 that'll be deposited to, you know, insulate or, you know, just keep the state prepared should any future liability arise. But as a former litigator, I also think that there are likely to be a lot of tort and nuisance cases that emerge should any leakage of that kind happen, particularly outside of the scope of a lease that would otherwise provide what a landowner's remedies might be. So I think, you know, we don't expect that type of litigation to, you know, pop up like crazy or something, just given the amount of work that they've done to make sure that any storage facility is going to be secure. But I think tort and nuisance would probably be a, you know, a likely remedy.
If I can add, just from a technical perspective, we've had our EERC look into, you know, what happens to the CO2 once it's injected. You know, it's in a supercritical state when it's in the injection phase, and once it's actually injected and in the geologic formation, it's, you know, at depth, it's at pressure, it kind of changes some of the chemical properties of the CO2. And we've looked into one of the questions raised was, can we reproduce that CO2? Let's say we develop a very robust market for CO2 sometime in the future, and we actually want to reproduce that CO2, pull it back from the ground and use it for something. Well, they've determined that once it's in the underground injection formation, it's virtually impossible for it to get back out. It's virtually impossible for us, even if we wanted to reproduce it. It would be you know, changing in properties so much, it's just not real possible for that to, you know, be able to be reproduced and get back out.
See if there's any last questions from the chat in our closing minutes here. When applying for state primacy and entering into MOUs with the EPA, did Wyoming or North Dakota find the process too rigid to accommodate for their state's needs, i.e. cultural, economic, environmental? Is this a concern for future states?
Say, you know, since we were the first state, maybe we had a bit more of a painful process just because everyone was learning and we were kind of the first. And I don't know how Wyoming felt, but I would guess that future states may have an easier process to go through now that we've had a few states go through it.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, what I'm aware of about the process when Wyoming obtained primacy was that, you know, North Dakota had kind of paved the road in a way, and some roadblocks were identified. Our states are really similar. So I think that a lot of those issues were, you know, able to be resolved before Wyoming got there. But I'm not sure specifically if the primacy process itself would generate any cultural, economic, or environmental, you know, concerns. I think that Wyoming was pleased to be able to take the process under its own control and try to expedite things.
Yeah. Very good. So we're in the closing minutes here. So I guess before we wrap it up, I guess I'll give it to Reice or Maddie if you have any closing thoughts or maybe topics you didn't get to raise. We covered a lot of ground here.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I guess my closing remarks would really just be, once again, seeing this from a beneficial use framework versus a waste disposal framework, really seeing future opportunity in CO2, in particular on the utilization side.
Yeah, and I think that kind of pairs with what I was going to say as a final comment, which is I think the importance for community engagement and, you know, that's timely and targeted and conscientious is really critical for the success of this industry in the long term. But I think one way to do that and show that this is a, safe and effective technology is to point exactly to what Reice is talking about. Wyoming has used CO2 and enhanced oil recovery for many years now, as has North Dakota. And I think that's the, greatest example of how we know that this technology is safe. So yeah, I thank everybody for their time.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both, and my sincere gratitude to Madeleine and Reice for taking some time to join me on today's webinar. I hope you will join us for the next Decarbonizing the West webinar, where we will be discussing permitting for carbon transport infrastructure. We'll have registration and additional speaker information for that available soon on WGA's website, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all for tuning in today, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.